In the middle years of World War II, engineers and officers on every side started to think about speed in a new way. Early in the war, fighters and bombers still belonged to the age of propellers and polished metal skins. They were fast by the standards of the 1930s, but they were still bound by the push of a spinning propeller through the air. As the war dragged on and casualties climbed, a harder question began to echo in design bureaus and wind tunnels. How fast could a human pilot really go and still fight a battle in the sky? In Germany, this question turned into something close to an obsession. Each new wave of Allied bombers pushed deeper into German territory, and the old interceptor designs struggled to climb high enough and fast enough to meet them. On drawing boards in places like Augsburg and Messerschmitt Works, radical ideas took shape. Liquid fuel rockets. Jet turbines that gulped air and spat it out at incredible speed. Swept wings that sliced through the airflow instead of pushing against it like a blunt tool. The small team behind the aircraft that would be called Me-163 did not set out to build a comfortable fighter. They were trying to build a pure interceptor, a machine that could rise from the runway like a thrown spear, cut through a bomber formation, then glide home once its fuel was gone. They knew the rocket engine would be dangerous, the landing gear unconventional, the flight time painfully short. None of that mattered as much as raw speed and climb rate. In the quiet of design offices, the idea seemed brilliant. A defender that appeared almost out of nowhere, made one devastating pass, and vanished again. On test fields, the reality was harsher. The rocket fuel was volatile and toxic. Technicians moved carefully around the little tailless aircraft, knowing that one mistake could turn it into a fireball before it even left the ground. Test pilots trained for this new kind of flight, memorizing emergency procedures for a craft that gave them only minutes of power time. The first flights were cautious, with the rocket throttled back and altitude kept modest. Even so, the aircraft climbed like nothing else in the sky. The ground fell away in a steep arc, and the world pushed hard against the pilot's chest. By 1944, the team was ready to push the limits. On 6 July that year, German test pilot Heini Dittmar took the Me-163 to a place no pilot had gone before. The small rocket aircraft roared along its takeoff run, shedding its wheeled trolley and leaping into the air. As the rocket burned, the machine climbed and accelerated, pressing Dittmar deeper into his seat. Instruments twitched at the edge of their scales. Outside the cockpit, the world blurred. The airframe shook as the aircraft sliced into speeds near 702 miles per hour, far beyond the reach of any propeller-driven fighter of the day. For a few moments, Dittmar and his aircraft rode the boundary of the unknown. Shock waves moved over the wings and fuselage. Control surfaces felt heavy and strange. Engineers on the ground later tried to piece together exactly how fast the aircraft had gone from instrument readings and fragmentary notes. Whatever the exact figure, it was clear that the little rocket plane had leapt far ahead of anything else that had flown in the war. The record would stand for years, a symbol of how far desperation and innovation could push human flight. Yet even as the team celebrated the achievement, troubling questions lingered. The aircraft could reach astonishing speed, but only for a brief window of time. The rocket burned its fuel quickly. After that, the pilot was left to glide back to base in a machine that handled very differently without the weight of fuel and the force of the engine. Landing on a skid instead of wheels demanded precision and nerve. A hard touchdown could damage the airframe or injure the pilot. On top of that, aiming guns at such speed would be difficult. The time spent actually in front of a bomber formation, close enough to fire, might be only a heartbeat or two. In hangars and briefing rooms, some officers saw the Me-163 as a miracle weapon, the answer to the bomber threat. Others, more cautious, wondered whether they were chasing the wrong prize. They looked at the cramped cockpit, the dangerous fuel, the short endurance, and asked themselves what would matter more in a long war. An aircraft that could briefly outrun everything, or one that could stay in the air for hours, escorting vulnerable bombers to their targets and back. Far away, on other airfields under very different flags, designers were struggling with the same trade-offs. They faced questions of range, reliability, and fuel consumption rather than sheer outright speed. While the world stared at record numbers and radical shapes, more balanced machines were quietly taking form. The record flight of the Mi-163 hinted at a future of incredible performance, but it also cast a long shadow. It showed what was possible, and it exposed how difficult it was to turn pure speed into lasting advantage in war. As the summer of 1944 wore on, the little rocket fighter moved from test fields to operational units. Pilots trained to intercept Allied bombers with a climb that felt like a controlled rocket launch. Ground crews rehearsed the complex fueling steps again and again. Each sortie carried risk before the aircraft ever left the Earth. Still, the promise of unmatched speed kept the program alive. The stage was set for the Mi-163 to prove itself in combat, and for the world to learn whether this daring leap into the future could really change the course of the air war. When the Mi-163 moved from test fields to frontline service, it entered a sky already crowded with contrails and explosions. Allied heavy bombers crossed German territory almost every clear day now, long silver lines stretching from horizon to horizon. Below them, sirens wailed and radar screens flickered. Ground controllers tracked formations as they moved toward refineries, marshalling yards, and aircraft factories. Each raid meant more damage, more burned metal, more lost crews. The promise of a defender that could reach the bombers faster than anything else felt urgent, almost desperate. On newly prepared airstrips, small teams received their rocket fighters. The aircraft looked alien compared to the familiar long-nosed propeller machines. Its short wings and tailless shape made it seem more like an experimental glider than a weapon of war. Beneath that odd shape, though, lay remarkable power. Ground crews prepared it with a careful ritual, handling two separate fuel components that reacted violently when mixed. Protective suits, strict procedures, and constant vigilance became part of daily life. A careless spill could corrode metal or burn skin. An unnoticed leak could turn a takeoff run into an instant catastrophe. Even before combat began, the Mi-163 reshaped the rhythm of the airfield. Conventional fighters could be refueled, rearmed, and sent back up several times a day. The rocket interceptor demanded long preparation for a single short flight. Mechanics and technicians worked slowly and methodically, watching valves, seals, and lines. Pilots studied emergency manuals that described what to do if fuel entered the cockpit, if the engine failed high above the field, if the landing skid refused to extend. The machine offered incredible performance, but it asked its crews to live with a constant awareness of danger. When the first alarm sounded and controllers ordered a scramble, the rocket fighter showed its unique character. The pilot strapped in, systems were checked, and the small aircraft lurched forward on its wheeled trolley. As it accelerated down the runway, the pilot released the trolley and felt the machine leap free. The rocket drove it upward in a steep climb that felt almost vertical compared to conventional fighters. While other interceptors clawed for altitude in long spirals, the Mi-163 pointed nearly straight at the bombers and surged upward. From the perspective of bomber crews, the first encounters with this new defender were unsettling. Gunners were used to seeing enemy fighters approach from long distances, closing slowly, leaving time to track them and build a firing solution. The rocket interceptor appeared as a distant speck that grew larger at an alarming rate. In seconds, it went from a tiny dot to a blur streaking past the formation. Sometimes there was only a brief flash of wings and a faint impression of a small, tailless shape. To many gunners, it seemed less like an airplane and more like a projectile. Inside the Mi-163 cockpit, the pilot faced a different kind of problem. The climb brought the aircraft to the bomber stream with astonishing speed, but it left only a tiny window to aim and fire. Closing speeds could exceed the experience of any pre-war training. The interceptor pilot had to judge distance, angle, and deflection in a narrow slice of time, while the aircraft shook from buffeting and compressibility effects near the limits of its design. A single pass might last only a few seconds. If the pilot misjudged the approach, the opportunity would vanish and the bomber would slide past unscathed. Engineers tried to help by fitting powerful cannon and exploring special upward firing weapons that could be triggered as the interceptor passed under a bomber. These ideas carried their own complications. Ammunition load was limited. Complex systems added weight and maintenance demands to an already delicate design. In practice, the Mi-163 scored some kills, but nowhere near what its raw specifications seemed to promise. Over 11 months of combat, it brought down only a handful of bombers, roughly 9 victories in total. Each success came at the cost of many sorties, many dangerous landings, and sometimes fatal accidents that had nothing to do with enemy fire. The landing phase proved as hazardous as any enemy encounter. After its short burst of rocket-powered flight, the aircraft became a fast glider with no second chance. The pilot had to judge altitude, distance, and glide path precisely. The landing skid had to be deployed at just the right moment. Too high, and the aircraft might stall. Too fast, and it could bounce, skid off the prepared surface, or break apart. The volatile fuel still lingering in tanks or lines meant that a rough touchdown could have consequences far beyond a bent airframe. Field reports began to accumulate, describing cracked fuselages, injured pilots, and aircraft lost without ever firing a shot. As these realities emerged, the image of the rocket fighter shifted. On paper, it was still one of the most advanced machines ever sent into combat. In briefing rooms, officers could point to its climb rate, its top speed, its ability to reach high-altitude bomber streams in minutes. In practice, the combination of short endurance, hazardous fuel, and tiny firing windows reduced its effectiveness. It frightened bomber crews, forced them to adapt, and proved that powered flight could leap far beyond the old limits of propeller-driven machines. Yet it rarely managed to change the outcome of a raid. The bombers still reached their targets, still dropped their loads, still turned for home. Within design offices and tactical commands, questions grew sharper. The Mi-163 had shown what a rocket interceptor could do, but it had also laid bare the costs of chasing pure speed without equal attention to endurance and handling. Pilots needed not only to catch the enemy but also to stay with them, to make repeated attacks, to survive long enough to fly again the next day. Ground crews needed machines that could be serviced and launched in steady rhythm, not temperamental rockets that demanded elaborate rituals for each sortie. At the same time, another experimental aircraft was taking shape in hangars not far away. It promised high speed but with a different kind of power. Instead of a brief, violent burn of rocket fuel, it relied on continuous thrust from early jet turbines. This new machine, the Mi-262, would not climb as steeply as the rocket interceptor, but it could stay fast for much longer once airborne. Prototypes darted across test ranges, their engines whistling rather than roaring. Engineers watched them with a different sort of hope, wondering if this new approach might finally yield an aircraft that could turn advanced technology into real control of the sky. For a time, the Mi-163 and the emerging jet projects existed side by side, two different answers to the same urgent problem. One embodied the idea of a short-lived, extreme interceptor, trading almost everything for a brief flash of speed. The other hinted at a future in which high speed and sustained flight could live together in a single design. As the war moved into its final, more desperate phases, the balance between these ideas grew more important. The lessons of the rocket fighter would not be forgotten, but the center of attention was already beginning to shift toward the jet age that lay just beyond the horizon. While the rocket fighter struggled to turn its extreme speed into real control of the sky, another machine was quietly preparing to reshape aviation in a different way. On test fields scattered across Germany, a sleek twin-engine aircraft with swept wings and narrow nacelles began to appear. To ground crews used to wide propeller discs and piston engines, this new aircraft looked strangely clean. No spinning blades, no exhaust stacks along the nose, only slim jet intakes and smooth metal skin. This was the Mi-262, an early jet fighter that pointed more clearly toward the future than any rocket-powered experiment. The idea behind the jet was simple in theory but difficult in practice. Instead of driving a propeller, the engine would swallow air, compress it, mix it with fuel, and ignite the mixture in a continuous stream. The expanding gases would rush out of the rear and push the aircraft forward. This concept had been explored before the war, in different countries and laboratories, but turning it into a reliable, combat-ready engine was another matter. Materials had to survive high temperatures. Compressors had to spin at incredible speeds. Fuel control systems had to manage a delicate balance between thrust and stability. Early Me-262 prototypes revealed both the promise and the problems of this new power. On takeoff runs, the engines responded more slowly than piston power plants. Pilots had to be gentle with the throttle to avoid compressor stalls or flameouts. Once airborne and clear of the ground, however, the character of the aircraft changed. The twin jets pulled steadily, building speed without the familiar vibration of a propeller. The aircraft cut through the air with a smooth, almost effortless sensation. Test pilots reported that once the jets were running properly, the machine felt like it wanted to keep accelerating as long as fuel remained. Compared to the propeller fighters of the day, the Me-262 offered a different world of performance. Its top speed exceeded that of most Allied and German piston aircraft by a wide margin. It could cruise faster than many opponents could achieve in a dive. Bomber crews who first encountered it saw a sleek shape that closed in from the rear or from below at speeds they were not used to. Unlike the rocket fighter, however, the jet could maintain its pace for more than a brief climb. It had enough endurance to make repeated passes, to break away, circle, and come back again. Development was not smooth. The jet engines were fragile, especially in their early forms. They used alloys that struggled under prolonged heat and stress. Maintenance demands were high, and engine life was often measured in tens of hours rather than hundreds. Fuel consumption at high thrust was significant, and the aircraft needed careful planning to make the most of each sortie. Political decisions also interfered. At various points, leaders pushed for the jet to be used as a fast bomber rather than as a pure fighter, delaying its introduction in the role where it could have made the greatest tactical impact. Even so, by 1944 and 1945, Me-262 units began to reach operational status. Pilots converted from piston fighters found that the jet required new habits. They had to adjust their timing, their energy management, and even their sense of how fast the world should appear to move past the canopy. In combat, they learned to use the aircraft's speed as both sword and shield. Against bomber formations, they could approach from angles that made defensive fire more difficult, unleash bursts from heavy cannon, then climb or dive away faster than escort fighters could easily follow. For Allied pilots flying conventional fighters, encounters with jets felt like glimpses of another era. A propeller fighter might dive with all its might, engine screaming, only to see the jet still pulling away in level flight. Chasing a Me-262 required anticipation and luck. The best moments to attack came during takeoff and landing, when the jet was slower, lower, and less able to use its speed advantage. Many Allied briefings emphasized this, urging pilots to catch the jets near their airfields rather than trying to run them down in open sky. Despite its advantages, the Me-262 arrived late and in limited numbers. Production was disrupted by bombing, shortages of materials, and the general strain of a war turning against Germany on multiple fronts. Fuel supplies were increasingly fragile. Experienced pilots were harder to replace. The jet proved capable of tearing through bomber formations and scattering escorts when conditions lined up, but it could not be everywhere at once. Its impact was sharp but narrow, more a sign of what might have been possible with more time and resources than a weapon that could reverse the course of the conflict. What the Me-262 did provide, beyond its immediate combat record, was a clear demonstration that high speed and sustained flight could be combined in a single platform. Unlike the rocket interceptor, which burned bright and faded quickly, the jet fighter stayed in the battle long enough to shape engagements more than once per sortie. It still demanded careful handling and considerable maintenance, but it pointed the way toward a new normal in which jet power would become standard. Designers in other nations watched closely, collecting intelligence from wrecks, pilot reports, and post-war evaluations. After the fighting ended in Europe, captured Me-262 airframes and engines became valuable research tools. Engineers and test pilots in the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union examined them, flew them, and measured their performance. They identified weaknesses in engine design, structural details, and systems, but they also recognized the significance of what they were seeing. The jet age was clearly not a distant dream any longer. It had already appeared in wartime skies, and it would soon define peacetime aviation as well. Yet even as jets promised a faster future, another story was unfolding around a different kind of fighter, one that did not break records for pure speed but changed the war in a more practical way. On long escort missions over occupied Europe, a lean, long-ranged aircraft with a liquid-cooled engine and laminar flow wings began to make its presence felt. It could not match a rocket plane's climb or a jet's top speed, but it could stay with bomber formations from departure to target and back again. While experimental aircraft hinted at tomorrow, this machine, the P-51, was quietly solving the problems of today's air war in a way that raw speed alone had not managed to do. While Germany poured effort into rockets and jets, another struggle was unfolding high above occupied Europe. Day after day, long columns of four-engine bombers climbed away from English airfields and set course toward targets deep inside the continent. Refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, marshalling yards. Each objective lay behind layers of flak guns and waiting fighters. The theory behind this daylight bombing campaign said that tight formations, heavy defensive guns, and precise navigation would eventually break the enemy's capacity to wage war. In practice, the losses were terrible whenever the bombers had to go beyond the reach of their escorts. Early in the campaign, fighters like the Spitfire and the P-47 Thunderbolt rose from their bases to protect the bomber streams. They were fast, heavily armed, and well-liked by their pilots. Yet their fuel tanks imposed a hard limit that strategy could not ignore. Escorts could accompany the bombers only for part of the journey. At a certain invisible line over Europe, they had to turn back or risk running dry on the way home. Beyond that line, the bombers flew alone. German interceptor units learned to watch for that moment. Once the escorts peeled away, attacks grew bolder and more coordinated. Losses climbed so high on some deep raids that commanders had to question whether such missions could continue at all. The need was simple to state and difficult to satisfy. The bomber crews needed a fighter that could fly almost as far as they did, fast enough to meet enemy interceptors on equal or better terms, and agile enough to fight over hostile territory and still bring its pilot home. Designers and officers debated how to balance these demands. More fuel meant more weight. More weight could mean lower performance or larger airframes that lost some of their edge in combat. At first, it seemed as if any solution powerful enough to fight would fall short on range, and any design with enough fuel would be too sluggish to face the sharpest enemy fighters. Into this problem stepped a lean, new aircraft that had begun life as a response to a British request. Built by North American Aviation and refined with a powerful Merlin engine and laminar flow wings, the new fighter showed an unusual mix of traits in testing. It could climb well, move fast, and still carry fuel for longer flights than many of its peers. When fitted with external drop tanks that could be discarded in combat, its effective range stretched even farther. The designation on the paperwork said P-51, but to crews and pilots it quickly became known by a simpler name. The Mustang did not set absolute speed records. It could not match the brief rocket-powered surge of the Me-163, and it could not quite reach the highest peak speeds of a well-flown Me-262 jet in level flight. Where it excelled was in the combination of speed, range, and steady handling. It could cruise alongside bomber formations for hours, climb above them to meet threats, and then sprint or dive as the tactical situation demanded. Its cockpit offered the pilot good visibility. Its systems could be maintained on busy front-line airfields. It was a machine built not for a single spectacular moment but for repeated use day after day. When Mustang groups began to take up escort duties on the longest missions, the atmosphere around the bomber offensive slowly shifted. Instead of turning back at a line over Europe, these fighters stayed with the bombers almost from the moment they formed up to the moment they turned for home. Crews who had once watched their escorts vanish toward the west now saw slender single-seat fighters sliding into formation and remaining there as the coastline fell behind and the interior of Germany came into view. The psychological effect of this change was almost as important as the physical one. Tactics evolved to take advantage of the Mustang's strengths. Rather than sitting close to the bombers at all times, fighters could range ahead and to the sides, sweeping for enemy formations before they reached the vulnerable heavy aircraft. They could climb above the bomber stream and dive onto attackers, then zoom back up again, confident that their fuel loads allowed for a broader patrol pattern. The message to German fighter units was plain. Attacks would no longer be launched against isolated bomber boxes with a narrow ring of escorts and a clear window after those escorts left. Instead, enemy fighters could find agile opponents waiting for them at multiple points along the route. For German pilots already grappling with the complexities of rocket interceptors and fragile jets, the Mustang introduced a quieter but more relentless problem. It might not appear as a sudden blur at extreme speed, but it was there for much longer. It could meet them near the coast, over the targets, and again during the withdrawal. Its pilots learned the habits of the enemy units, the routes toward assembly points, the typical directions of attack. The same aircraft that covered the bombers could also hunt escorting or climbing fighters in their own right. Over time, statistics began to reflect what crews were feeling in the air. Bomber loss rates on deeply penetrating missions declined compared to the worst earlier raids. There were still terrible days, still heavy flak, still determined attacks by experienced German units. Yet the balance of risk shifted. Allied command could plan strikes against targets once considered too costly, knowing that the combination of improved tactics and long-ranged escort fighters gave the crews a better chance of survival. In briefing rooms, maps filled with lines showing not only the bomber routes but also the fighter support arcs that now extended deep into enemy territory. From the standpoint of pure engineering, observers could see a pattern emerging. The Mustang's success did not come from any single extreme quality. It was not the fastest aircraft in the world or the most radical in shape. Its breakthrough lay in how its designers and users balanced competing demands. Speed enough to fight. Range enough to escort. Handling qualities that kept pilots effective even after long hours over hostile ground. Reliability that let squadrons generate sortie after sortie. Each element might be modest when viewed in isolation, but together they formed a tool uniquely suited to the actual tasks of the air war. The contrast with the Me-163 and the Me-262 grew clearer as more data and experience accumulated. The rocket fighter represented a bold leap outward to test the boundaries of speed and climb. The jet fighter pointed to a future in which those speeds could be sustained. The Mustang embodied an answer to the question of what could win battles here and now. It did not ignore performance, but it refused to chase it at the expense of endurance and practicality. In the crowded skies of 1944, that balance began to matter more than any single performance figure written on a test report. As the war moved into its final year, the Mustang's silhouette became a familiar sight not only to bomber crews but also to friend and foe on the ground. People looking up from towns, fields, and flak batteries saw it passing overhead, sometimes shepherding bomber streams, sometimes diving on airfields or rail lines in fighter-bomber roles. The aircraft's long legs allowed planners to use it in flexible ways, turning it into more than a specialist escort and giving it a role in the broader effort to wear down the enemy's capacity to resist. Amid these larger patterns, individual pilots experienced the shift in a more personal way. Some had flown earlier fighters with limited range and remembered the frustration of turning back while bomber boxes pushed on without cover. Others converted from different types and discovered that their new mounts gave them the endurance to stay in the fight longer and range wider over enemy territory. Among these pilots were men who would later test even faster machines in the post-war years, bridging the gap between wartime propeller fighters and the supersonic age. Their stories tied the Mustang's balanced wartime role to the next steps in the search for speed and altitude that would follow once peace returned. The stage was slowly being set for a new kind of race. No longer a wartime scramble to build a single miracle weapon, but a peacetime effort to understand what human pilots and airframes could endure as speeds climbed toward and beyond the sound barrier. The lessons drawn from rockets, jets, and Mustangs would shape that next chapter. And some of the pilots who had wrestled these wartime machines through cloud and flak would soon find themselves climbing into experimental craft with even more demanding performance and even thinner margins for error. Behind every leap in aircraft design during and after World War II stood a small group of people who were willing to strap into unproven machines and find out what the numbers on paper really meant. Engineers could sketch new wings and engines, commanders could demand more speed and range, but it was the test pilots and combat pilots who carried those ideas into the thin upper air where mistakes could not easily be forgiven. In the cramped cockpits of rocket interceptors, jets, and long-ranged fighters, They faced not only the enemy but also the limits of their own bodies and reflexes. 4 pilots assigned to the Mi-163 rocket fighter, every flight began with a quiet calculation. They knew the dangers of the fuel beneath and behind them. They had heard stories of ground crew injured by spills, of aircraft lost when tanks ruptured on landing. They studied diagrams of the escape procedure, even though they understood that bailing out from a small, fast glider after a brief rocket burn might be more theory than practical plan. During the run-up, as gauges settled into their marks and the canopy closed, they sat surrounded by dials that promised both unmatched performance and a very short window in which to use it. The takeoff felt less like the start of a normal sortie and more like the launch of a projectile. Acceleration pushed the pilot back. The trolley clattered away. The nose lifted and the ground dropped away in a steep climb. In those first seconds, the pilot had to keep the aircraft true, watching the climb angle, minding the speed, and resisting the temptation to pull too hard. In training flights, some pilots reported that the horizon seemed to rotate around the cockpit more rapidly than their senses could keep up with. The physical strain of the climb pressed on their chests and blurred their vision at the edges. Reaching the bomber stream added a mental strain to the physical one. The pilot had to shift from pure climb to attack mode, aligning a small, fast-moving aircraft with large, well-defended targets in a sky crowded with explosions and tracers. Each control movement had to be measured. Too much input at high speed could overstress the airframe or cause a sudden loss of control. Yet hesitating for even a moment could allow the bomber to slip out of the gun sight. The pilot's mind worked at high speed, running through lead angles, closure rates, and the brief opportunities presented as the aircraft shot past the formation. When the fuel tanks ran low, the nature of the flight changed again. The rocket cut off. Silence replaced the roar. The aircraft transitioned from a violent climb to a steep glide. The pilot now had to nurse altitude and energy back to the home airfield, planning a pattern that allowed no second attempt. There was no throttle to open for a go-around if the approach looked wrong. The landing skid had to meet the ground exactly once, at an angle and speed that kept the fragile machine in one piece. More than one pilot later remembered that the moments before touchdown felt even more tense than the attack run through the bombers. In the Mi-262, the strains were different but no less real. Jet pilots dealing with early engines had to treat their power plants with a kind of cautious respect. Rapid throttle movements could cause flameouts or damaging surges. On takeoff, the engines needed time to spool up, leaving the aircraft vulnerable if enemy fighters appeared or if the runway came under fire. Once airborne and cruising at high speed, however, the pilot felt the strange smoothness of jet thrust. The absence of propeller vibration and the steady, rising rush of air around the canopy created an almost eerie sensation of effortlessness as the landscape slid by far below. In combat, jet pilots faced choices of timing and position that could decide life or death in seconds. They knew their aircraft could outrun most opponents in level flight. They also knew their engines were fragile, their fuel limited, and their numbers small. A rash decision to stay too long in a fight, or to chase a distant target, could leave them short of fuel or drifting down alone over hostile territory. For many, the best use of their machine lay in brief, sharp attacks and clean withdrawals, trading on speed while avoiding the traps that came with overconfidence. On the other side, pilots flying more conventional fighters like the Mustang experienced their own version of the edge. Long-range escort missions demanded hours of concentration. The flight might begin in calm weather over friendly fields, but soon the pilots were navigating through layers of cloud, over enemy flak zones, and into skies where radar-guided fighters and sudden ambushes were constant threats. Fatigue crept into shoulders and arms as they held formation, scanned the horizon, and listened for the clipped instructions coming over the radio. When enemy fighters appeared, Mustang pilots had to shift instantly from measured escort patterns to aggressive maneuvers. They rolled, climbed, and dived, using their aircraft's speed and handling to break up attacks before they reached the bombers. In this swirling chaos, the pilot's sense of position and energy became vital. Losing track of altitude or speed could mean stalling at the wrong moment or diving too fast into the path of friend or foe. Even when the immediate fight was over, the sortie often still had hours of flight left. The pilot had to calm breathing, check fuel, and returned to the steady work of getting the bombers and their escorts back across the lines. Among the men who flew Mustangs in combat was a young American pilot named Chuck Yeager. He experienced firsthand the demands of escort missions, air combat, and survival behind enemy lines after being shot down. Captured and then escaping with the help of resistance networks, he returned to flying and gained a reputation for precision and calm under pressure. His war did not center on experimental rocket craft or jets. Instead, it revolved around squeezing every advantage from a propeller-driven fighter that had been designed to balance speed, range, and handling. After the war, Yeager carried the lessons of those Mustang sorties into a new role as a test pilot. While the world gradually shifted from wartime urgency to uneasy peace, a fresh set of questions emerged in research centers and Air Force offices. The war had shown that aircraft could approach the speed of sound. It had also shown that near that boundary, strange things happened. Controls stiffened. Buffeting increased. Some aircraft lost stability or broke apart. Pilots and engineers wanted to know whether there was a hard wall in the sky, a limit beyond which manned flight could not pass, or whether careful design and refined control could push through into a new regime. In this new environment, the experience gained from wartime machines mattered. Test pilots had to understand how it felt when an aircraft approached the uneasy region near transonic speeds. They had to read the signs of compressibility, shock waves, and changing control responses, just as combat pilots had read the hints of stall or overstress in their fighters. The difference now was that the goal was not to defeat other aircraft but to defeat ignorance. The stakes remained high. An error in a rocket-powered research plane at high altitude could be as final as a mistake in a dogfight. As Yeager and others trained for these missions, they carried with them memories of climbs through flak, of high-speed dives over enemy airfields, of long returns with engines barely holding together. The courage required in this new test flying was not fundamentally different from that shown in wartime skies. It still involved strapping into machines whose full behavior was not yet known, trusting the work of designers and ground crews, and accepting that some questions could only be answered by going out and flying. The experimental aircraft that waited for them on desert runways and remote fields drew directly on lessons learned from designs like the Me-163, the Me-262, and the P-51. Slim wings, powerful engines, and durable structures all reflected the combined experience of years of wartime improvisation and innovation. The new goal, however, looked beyond the range charts and combat reports of the recent conflict. It aimed at the thin line on performance graphs where airspeed numbers brushed against the speed of sound and the curves turned uncertain. With each new flight, the test pilots would push a little closer to that line, then back off, then approach again with small adjustments. They would describe the feel of the controls, the onset of shaking, the patterns of shock waves on the wings. Engineers would adjust designs and run new calculations. The work was methodical and often slow, but it moved steadily toward a question that had fascinated designers since the first hints of high-speed flight. Could a manned aircraft not only survive near the speed of sound but also pass beyond it under control? The answer to that question would become the turning point in the story that had begun with wartime rockets and long-ranged escorts, and some of the same pilots who had flown through the smoke of World War II would now help write the next chapter in clear, cold upper air. In the years immediately after World War II, airfields that had once echoed with the sound of combat began to host a quieter but no less intense kind of flying. The war had left behind a wealth of experience, mountains of data, and a generation of pilots and engineers who had seen aircraft pushed to limits that pre-war designers could barely imagine. Rocket interceptors had brushed the edge of transonic flight. Jet fighters had shown that high speed could be sustained rather than tasted for only a few minutes. Long-ranged escorts had proved the value of endurance and careful balance. Now, attention shifted to a single narrow frontier in the performance charts, a place where airspeed crept toward the speed of sound and the behavior of aircraft grew uncertain. During the war, pilots in fast piston fighters and early jets had already felt the warning signs. In steep dives, controls that were usually light became stiff and unresponsive. Shock waves formed along wings and tail surfaces. Buffeting shook the aircraft, sometimes so violently that instruments blurred and structures creaked. More than one pilot had lost an aircraft in these conditions, leaving others to describe how the machine had seemed to lock up or break apart when the airspeed needle drove too far into the red. Stories spread of a hard barrier in the sky, an invisible wall that punished any attempt to push too close. Engineers did not like the idea of a mystical limit, but they respected the evidence. Wind tunnel tests, backed by wartime research, showed that as flows around wings approached sonic speed, pressure distributions changed rapidly. Shock waves could shift the center of lift. Control surfaces might suddenly lose effectiveness or reverse their usual responses. The phenomenon was complex and not yet fully mapped. What made it more challenging was that many existing aircraft had not been designed with these effects in mind. Their structures, control layouts, and profiles belonged to an earlier era. When forced into transonic regions, they reacted in ways nobody had planned for. In the United States, a new effort took shape to answer the question in a more controlled way. Instead of forcing conventional fighters into high-speed dives and hoping they would survive, designers proposed building a purpose-made research aircraft. It would be small, strong, and shaped specifically to explore the transonic region. Its job would not be to carry guns or bombs, or to range over battlefronts, but to test the behavior of air at very high speed. Data collected from its flights would feed directly into the next generation of military and civilian aircraft, including the emerging family of jet designs. The result of this thinking was a compact, rocket-powered aircraft built by a team at Bell. Its shape was different from the sleek lines of a Mustang or the twin-engine spread of a jet fighter. The fuselage had the clean, tapered form of a bullet. The wings were thin and short, designed to ride the complex pressures of high speed rather than to provide gentle handling at low speed. A rocket engine in the rear promised strong, controllable thrust once the aircraft was released from its carrier. To get it into the air without wasting fuel on a long climb, planners arranged for it to be carried under the belly of a larger bomber and dropped at high altitude. Selecting the right pilot for this machine required more than bravery. The program needed someone who understood both combat conditions and the disciplined routines of test work. The pilot had to read instruments precisely while feeling subtle changes in control forces, then translate those sensations into clear reports for engineers on the ground. He also had to accept that the machine he flew did not yet have a proven safety record. Its behavior near the speed of sound would be hinted at by equations and wind tunnels, but not confirmed until a human being took it there. Chuck Yeager, with his background in wartime Mustang operations and his calm approach to high-stakes flying, emerged as a strong candidate. He had already demonstrated that he could handle long, demanding missions in fighters, recover from dangerous situations, and treat cutting-edge machines with a mix of respect and confidence. In the new test role, he applied the same habits he had learned escorting bombers and dogfighting over Europe. He prepared thoroughly, learned every system, and listened carefully to the ground crews and engineers who worked on the aircraft. The environment in which this new research aircraft would fly differed from the crowded skies of wartime Europe. Instead of flat clouds and bomber streams, there were wide expanses of clear desert air over places like the dry lake beds of California. On the ground, rows of instruments and observers replaced radar plots of enemy formations. Yet the underlying tension was familiar in a quieter way. Each flight carried risks not from opposing fighters but from the unknowns of aerodynamics at the edge of what materials and structures could handle. Before the first powered runs, there were gliding tests. The small rocket plane was carried aloft, released, and flown unpowered to see how it handled in more ordinary regimes. These early sorties echoed, in a distant way, the glide phases that Mi-163 pilots had experienced after their rocket burns. The stakes were different, and the design was more deliberately tailored to the task, but the fundamental idea of using gliding tests to understand handling before pushing to extremes remained the same. Yeager and other pilots reported on stability, control effectiveness, and landing behavior, allowing the team to refine techniques and procedures. On the ground, engineers studied every fragment of data. They recalculated stress limits, verified control surface responses, and checked how the aircraft behaved as it approached higher indicated airspeeds in shallow dives. The goal was to build a staircase of incremental steps, each one slightly closer to the region where compressibility effects would become dominant. Unlike the hurried wartime push to field weapons, this program tried to move deliberately, learning from each flight before authorizing the next. Still, the path led inevitably toward the line where airspeed numbers crept past known safe values and into the territory that had broken other aircraft. The contrast with wartime high-speed efforts was striking. The Mi-163 had been thrown into combat with many unknowns still unresolved, because the pressure of the bomber offensive demanded immediate action. The Mi-262 had entered service while its engines were still fragile and its best employment tactics were still being argued. In the desert test ranges, there was more room to pause between flights, more time to analyze and adjust. Yet the fundamental drive was the same. Each of these programs, in its own way, tried to transform raw speed into something that could be understood, controlled, and eventually incorporated into reliable operational aircraft. As the powered phase approached, preparations grew more detailed. Yeager and his team rehearsed the sequence of events on the day of a high-speed attempt. The larger carrier aircraft would climb with the rocket planes slung beneath it, reaching the altitude chosen for the drop. At the right moment, clamps would release. The research aircraft would fall for a brief instant, then its pilot would bring it to life, firing the rocket and guiding it onto the planned test profile. Instruments would record shock positions, control deflections, and airframe loads while the pilot tracked the feel of the controls and the motion of the airspeed indicator. Each of these steps had to be choreographed, because once the rocket was burning, events would unfold quickly. There would be no time to debate decisions in the cockpit. Just as Mi-163 pilots had only minutes of powered flight to climb and attack, the Bell research aircraft would have only a limited window in which to reach target speeds, collect data, and then shut down the engine to glide back to a landing. The challenge lay in using that brief period not to fire weapons but to probe the behavior of the air itself around the aircraft as it moved into the gray zone near the speed of sound. In briefing rooms before these flights, charts and diagrams covered tables and walls. Engineers traced curves showing expected pressure changes. Pilots traced their planned maneuvers through altitude and speed. Everyone in the room understood that the numbers on the page represented more than abstract calculations. They were predictions about what forces would act on metal, on control linkages, and on the human body strapped into the cockpit. The only way to confirm them was to fly. By the time the program was ready to push directly against the suspected barrier, years of wartime experience lay behind every decision. Lessons from rocket interceptors suggested how to handle short, powerful bursts of thrust and how to plan gliding returns. Lessons from jets informed thinking about high-speed control and engine management. Lessons from long-ranged escorts and their pilots reminded everyone that endurance and predictability mattered as much as raw performance if new designs were ever to move beyond the test range and into broader use. On mornings chosen for key flights, the desert air lay still and clear. Ground crews rolled the small rocket aircraft into place, checked its panels and fasteners, and prepared its fuel. The larger carrier loomed above it, waiting to lift it toward the thin air where the tests would be run. Somewhere in all of this, the path that had started with wartime scramble and emergency innovation narrowed to a single moment when a pilot, strapped into a compact cockpit, would feel the hand of gravity as the carrier let go and the rocket lit, pushing him and his machine toward a line in the sky that had so far remained unbroken.